The air inside the steel tube is thick with the scent of chemicals, a metallic tang that coats the back of the throat. The real danger is not what they can smell, it is the invisible vapor accumulating around them, a fuel waiting for a spark. A single routine action is about to transform this industrial task into a lethal event, sealing the only exit and beginning a countdown measured in atmospheric pressure and cellular starvation. October 2, 2007, Georgetown, Colorado. Xcel Energy's Cabin Creek hydroelectric facility operates a penstock tunnel, a massive water conduit that channels flow from an upper reservoir to turbines below. The tunnel measures 4,300 feet in total length, carved through rock and reinforced with steel. The first 1,770 feet is concrete. The remaining 1,530 feet is welded steel pipe sloping steeply downward into the mountain at a 40-degree angle. Inside this steel section, 11 workers from RPI Coating of Santa Fe Springs, California, have been contracted to recoat the interior surface. The job requires removing the existing coating, cleaning the bare metal, and applying a new epoxy layer. The environment is a permit-required confined space, a designation reserved for areas with limited entry, restricted airflow, and the potential for atmospheric hazards. The penstock qualifies on every count. 5 men are positioned approximately 2,500 feet inside the tunnel, working the upper section. Anthony Aguirre is 18 years old, Donald DeJanes is 43, Gary Foster is 48, Dupree Holt is 37, James St. Peters is 52. They carry sprayers, buckets, and mixing equipment. The tunnel around them is dark beyond their work lights, the walls curving inward, the air dense with epoxy fumes, and the sharp chemical odor of methyl ethyl ketone, MEK, a solvent used to thin the coating mixture. The work is methodical. Spray, move, repeat. The tunnel amplifies every sound. The hiss of compressed air, the metallic echo of footsteps, the low murmur of voices relayed over handheld radios. The temperature is cool, the humidity trapped, ventilation is minimal. The only exit is 1,700 feet downhill, where the steel section meets the concrete. There is no secondary egress, no escape hatch, no alternate route to the surface. The crew works in segments, moving progressively deeper into the tunnel as each section is completed. At 1,450 feet from the entrance, the steel pipe narrows the world to a single direction, forward into darkness or backward toward the exit. The 5 men are alone in the upper reach, separated from their colleagues by distance and the curvature of the pipe. They cannot see the entrance. They can only see the next 10 feet, illuminated by their lamps, and the black void stretching endlessly beyond. At some point during the afternoon, the decision is made to thin the epoxy mixture. The coating is too viscous, clogging the sprayer. MK is added to a hopper, a cylindrical container that feeds the spray equipment. The liquid pools at the bottom of the metal vessel, releasing vapor into the confined air. The vapor is heavier than oxygen, denser than the atmosphere around it, and it begins to settle in layers near the floor of the penstock. No one notices the accumulation. The vapor is invisible. It has no color, no immediate warning. It simply waits. The epoxy system is a 2-part formulation designed for industrial applications. Part A is the resin base, Part B is the hardener. Mixed together, they cure into a durable, chemically resistant coating. But before application, the mixture must be thinned to pass through the spray nozzle. For this, the crew uses methyl ethyl ketone, a solvent with a flash point of 16 degrees Fahrenheit, and a vapor that forms explosive mixtures with air at concentrations between 1.4 and 11.4%. The workers add the solvent directly into the sprayer base hopper, a metal drum mounted on a wheeled cart. The hopper is designed to mix and pressurize the coating before it is fed to the spray gun. It is not designed to handle volatile solvents in an unventilated confined space. The liquid MEK immediately begins to evaporate, releasing vapor that rises from the hopper, opening and spreads through the tunnel. The atmosphere inside the penstock is already compromised. Ventilation is insufficient to exhaust the chemical fumes. The airflow is stagnant, allowing the vapor to concentrate. Within minutes, the MEK vapor reaches a critical threshold. The lower explosive limit, where the mixture of fuel and oxygen becomes capable of sustaining combustion if an ignition source is present. At 1400 hours, an ignition source appears. The United States Chemical Safety Board later determines that the most probable cause is a static discharge inside the sprayer base hopper. When MK is poured into the metal container, friction between the liquid and the vessel generates an electrostatic charge. If the charge accumulates without a grounding path, it can arc across the gap between the liquid surface and the hopper walls. The arc measures only a few millijoules, less energy than the spark from a doorknob on a dry winter day, but it is sufficient. The vapor ignites instantly. The combustion is not an explosion in the traditional sense. no pressure wave, no structural detonation. It is a flash fire, a phenomenon where flammable vapor burns rapidly across a surface, consuming available fuel in seconds. The flame front races outward from the hopper, following the vapor concentration through the tunnel. The fire does not travel up the penstock toward the 5 men. It travels down, toward the exit, feeding on the solvent-laden air that has drifted downslope. The heat is immediate and intense. Exposed metal glows, paint blisters, the plastic casings on equipment melt. Workers near the fire scatter, shouting warnings into their radios. 4 men positioned below the ignition point run downhill, toward the entrance, escaping the flames. They reach the concrete section and continue to the surface, suffering burns and smoke inhalation, but surviving. But the 5 men positioned 2,500 feet inside the penstock, Aguirre, Dejanes, Foster, Holt and St. Peter's, are trapped on the wrong side of the fire. The flames now occupy the space between them and the exit. The only way out is through 1,400 feet of burning tunnel, and they cannot go through. The penstock is not a horizontal corridor, it is a steeply inclined pipe, descending at 40 degrees from the upper concrete section to the lower turbine intake. Gravity dictates the movement of air, heat, and combustion byproducts. The fire burns downslope, consuming oxygen and releasing carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and superheated gases. These gases rise due to thermal buoyancy, but the tunnel's slope channels them back upward along the ceiling, creating a thermal current that flows toward the trapped men. At the moment of ignition, the 5 workers are approximately 1,000 feet uphill from the flames. The distance offers temporary protection from direct heat exposure, but it creates a more insidious threat. The fire is now a barrier, not just a hazard. It occupies the only viable exit route. To escape, the men would need to descend through the inferno, navigating blind in smoke, enduring temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and hoping the steel structure does not collapse. The forensic record provides no evidence that this was attempted. Instead, the men retreat further into the tunnel. They move uphill, away from the fire, seeking distance and breathable air. But the penstock extends only so far. The upper terminus is a solid wall where the steel section meets the mountain rock. There is no hatch, no vertical shaft, no emergency exit. The tunnel is a dead end. The radios crackle. The men report their position. They confirm they are alive uninjured by the initial flash, but surrounded by smoke. The air quality is deteriorating rapidly. Ventilation fans, if they were running, are insufficient to clear the atmosphere. The fire consumes oxygen at the rate of several cubic meters per minute, replacing it with toxic gases that travel upward through convection and diffusion. Carbon monoxide is the primary threat. It is a colorless, odorless gas produced by incomplete combustion of organic materials, in this case, the epoxy coating, the MEK solvent, and any plastic or rubber components caught in the flames. CO molecules are roughly the same molecular weight as air, allowing them to mix thoroughly with the atmosphere rather than settling or rising predictably. Once inhaled, carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells with an affinity 200 times greater than oxygen. The resulting compound, carboxyhemoglobin, is stable and non-functional. It cannot transport oxygen to tissues. At low concentrations, carbon monoxide causes headache, dizziness, and confusion. At moderate concentrations, it induces nausea, impaired coordination, and visual disturbances. At high concentrations, above 1,200 parts per million, it causes loss of consciousness within minutes and death within an hour. The penstock atmosphere, fed by continuous combustion, rapidly exceeds this threshold. The men are now fighting a battle. The atmospheric chemistry has already decided. They can retreat no further. They can only wait and breathe. The radios continue to transmit for approximately 45 minutes after ignition. The men communicate with personnel at the surface, providing updates on their condition and location. The tone is initially calm, professional, controlled. They describe the smoke, the lack of visibility, the absence of escape routes. They request immediate rescue. But rescue is not immediate. The closest confined space technical rescue unit is stationed over an hour away. Xcel Energy has no on-site personnel trained or equipped for confined space entry and extraction under hazardous atmospheric conditions. The local fire department responds, but they lack the specialized equipment and protocols required for deep tunnel rescue in a toxic environment. The fire itself remains active, preventing direct access from the entrance. Any rescue attempt must wait for the flames to subside and the atmosphere to clear. The trapped men do not have an hour, they have minutes. The physiological progression of carbon monoxide poisoning is well documented. At 1,500 parts per million, symptoms appear within 10 to 15 minutes. Headache intensifies, vision narrows, cognitive function declines, the body's automatic regulatory systems begin to fail. Heart rate increases. In a futile attempt to deliver oxygenated blood, respiration deepens, pulling more contaminated air into the lungs. The feedback loop accelerates the poisoning. At 3,000 parts per million, unconsciousness occurs within 30 minutes. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Motor control is lost. Speech becomes incoherent. The last radio transmissions from the penstock are fragmented. Words slurred, sentences incomplete, then silence. The bodies are later found 2/3 of the way along the steel section, 2,500 feet from the entrance, approximately 1,000 feet uphill from the point of ignition. They are grouped together, suggesting the men remained in communication until the end. There is no evidence of trauma, no signs of thermal injury, no indication that they attempted to breach the steel walls or force an alternate exit. They simply ran out of breathable air. The cause of death is formally listed as asphyxiation due to inhalation of carbon monoxide. The forensic analysis confirms carboxyhemoglobin saturation levels consistent with lethal exposure. The men died not from heat, not from structural collapse, but from cellular starvation, the inability of their blood to deliver oxygen to their tissues despite the presence of oxygen in their lungs. It is a quiet death, often described as painless once consciousness is lost. But the 45 minutes preceding that loss are measured in mounting dread, failing vision, and the knowledge that help will not arrive in time. Their bodies were fighting a battle that the atmospheric chemistry had already decided. The investigation into the Cabin Creek incident is led by the United States Chemical Safety Board, an independent federal agency tasked with analyzing industrial accidents involving hazardous chemicals. The inquiry extends beyond the immediate cause of the fire to examine the chain of decisions and organizational failures that created the conditions for disaster. The first failure is contractor selection. Xcel Energy solicited bids for the penstock recoating project and selected RPI coating based primarily on cost. The contractor submitted the lowest bid among competing firms. However, RPI coating also held the lowest possible safety rating, 0, on a scale used by industry safety auditors to evaluate contractor performance. The rating indicated a history of violations, inadequate safety protocols, and insufficient training. Xcel Energy was aware of this rating, but proceeded with the contract, prioritizing cost reduction over safety assurance. The second failure is planning. The penstock is classified as a permit-required confined space under federal OSHA regulations. Entry into such spaces mandates a written plan that addresses atmospheric monitoring, ventilation emergency rescue procedures, and personnel training. Xcel Energy's plan for the Cabin Creek project was generic, not site-specific. It did not account for the unique geometry of the tunnel, the presence of flammable solvents, or the logistical challenges of deep tunnel rescue. The plan assumed that workers could self-rescue or that external responders could access the site within minutes. Neither assumption was valid. The third failure is rescue capability. Xcel Energy had no confined space rescue team on duty during the project. The company relied on local emergency services, which lacked the technical expertise and equipment required for confined space entry in hazardous atmospheres. The nearest qualified team was over an hour away by road. When the fire was reported at 1400 hours, the rescue unit was dispatched immediately, but the trapped workers died at approximately 1445 hours, 30 minutes before the team could reach the site. The delay was not due to negligence by the responders. It was due to the absence of on-site rescue resources that should have been mandated by the permit. The fourth failure is atmospheric control. The use of methyl ethyl ketone in an unventilated confined space violates basic principles of industrial hygiene. MEK is classified as a highly flammable liquid. Its vapor forms explosive mixtures with air at concentrations easily achieved in enclosed environments. Standard protocol requires continuous ventilation, real-time atmospheric monitoring, and elimination of ignition sources. None of these controls were implemented at Cabin Creek. The workers introduced gallons of solvent into a steel tunnel with minimal airflow, no vapor detection equipment, and electrical devices capable of generating sparks. The Chemical Safety Board's final report identifies 53 similar confined space incidents in the United States between 1993 and 2010, resulting in 45 fatalities. The pattern is consistent: inadequate planning, insufficient ventilation, absence of rescue capability, and the introduction of flammable materials into enclosed spaces. The Cabin Creek fire is not an anomaly. It is a case study in predictable, preventable failure. The most critical failure did not occur inside the penstock, it occurred on paper months earlier. On August 28, 2009, the United States Department of Justice filed a federal indictment against Xcel Energy and its subsidiary, Public Service Company of Colorado, The charges included 5 counts of violating OSHA confined space regulations, each count corresponding to one of the deceased workers, Anthony Aguirre, Donald DeJanes, Gary Foster, Dupree Holt, and James St. Peters. The indictment alleged that Xcel Energy knowingly failed to implement required safety measures, knowingly selected an unqualified contractor, and knowingly exposed workers to life-threatening conditions without adequate protection or rescue capability. The legal standard for corporate criminal liability requires proof that the company acted with deliberate disregard for known hazards, a threshold higher than negligence but lower than intent to harm. The trial proceeded in federal court. Prosecutors presented the Chemical Safety Board's findings, internal company documents showing awareness of the safety rating, and testimony from survivors and regulatory experts. The defense argued that the fire was an unforeseeable accident, that RPI Coating bore primary responsibility for on-site safety, and that Xcel Energy had implemented industry-standard practices for contractor oversight. On March 14, 2011, the jury returned a verdict. Xcel Energy and Public Service Company of Colorado were acquitted on all 5 counts. The legal outcome reflects the difficulty of prosecuting corporate entities for criminal negligence in industrial accidents. The standard of proof is high, requiring evidence that the company knowingly violated regulations with awareness of the specific risk. Juries are often reluctant to assign criminal liability to corporations, particularly when individual employees cannot be identified as directly responsible for the decisions in question. The acquittal does not negate the findings of the Chemical Safety Board. It simply reflects the limitations of criminal law in addressing systemic organizational failure. The forensic record remains clear. 5 men entered a confined space to perform a routine industrial task. They were provided with inadequate ventilation, no rescue capability, and a contractor with a 0 safety rating. When a flash fire ignited, they were trapped 2,500 feet inside a steel tunnel with no secondary exit. They communicated for 45 minutes as carbon monoxide displaced the oxygen in their blood. They died together, 1,000 feet from the flames, not from heat or trauma, but from the slow, invisible process of asphyxiation. Anthony Aguirre was 18, Donald DeJanes was 43, Gary Foster was 48, Dupree Holt was 37, James St. Peters was 52. Their deaths were preventable, the failures that caused them were documented, analyzed, and presented in exhaustive detail. The legal system declined to assign criminal responsibility. The forensic record was clear. The legal outcome was not. If you want the full forensic breakdown of how confined space incidents continue to claim lives despite decades of regulation, subscribe to Forensic Protocol so you don't miss the next investigation.